Good morning to those of you who are coming in. We're just going to wait a few moments to let people get logged into the webinar, and then we'll go ahead and start. Okay, so Natalie, it seems to be hanging steady at 32 right now, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. And good morning, everyone. And welcome to our Spring Gardening webinar series presented by the Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State University, and our sponsors. And thank you for joining us on this beautiful, a little chilly April day. My name's Vicki Miner, and I'll be your host. And Natalie Smith, another Master Gardener, is also assisting. Our presenter this morning is Amy Jo Detweiler, and she'll be talking to us today about Firewise landscaping. But first, I want to go through some housekeeping for our webinar. If you have been to any of our other series, then you probably know all this, but for those of you who are just coming in, all videos and microphones are off for our attendees, except for the presenters. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them in the Q&A window that you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen. Amy Jo will be taking time during the presentation and at the end to answer your questions. If you happen to like a question or you have the same question, you can upvote it. There's a little thumb symbol there that you can click on, and that will add you to that question. The presentation's being recorded and will be available online for a short time following the session. In a few days, you will be sent an email with a link to access the recording. So let me introduce Amy Jo. Amy Jo Detweiler is a professor and extension horticulturist, and she's responsible for teaching and outreach in community and commercial horticulture in the high desert environment of Central Oregon. She works with homeowners and green industry professionals. She specializes in sustainable landscape practices, including water-wise gardening, fire-wise landscaping, and backyard food production. She's also responsible for training and managing an active group of Master Gardener volunteers for a tri-county region. As the Western United States population continues to grow, more and more homes are creeping into forest and rangeland areas called the wildland-urban interface. The number of wildfires in combination with this urban sprawl can potentially increase the number of fire-prone landscapes. In this class, you'll learn about fire behavior basics, ways to reduce the fuel load, ways to design your landscape in the home ignition zone, characteristics of fire-resistant plants, and plant selection for your Firewise design. So at this point, I will turn things over to Amy Jo.
Morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm glad you're able to join us this morning, and we're going to talk today about Firewise landscaping. I will start partway. I'll stop somewhere in the middle of the presentation to see what kinds of questions we got going on, and I'll do that maybe once or twice, and at the end of the presentation as well. So feel free to ask questions as we go. And let's go ahead and get started. All right, you should all be able to see the title slide right now.
Yes, we can, Amy Jo.
Okay, great. Let me go ahead and start that. Okay, so an overview for today, we're going to look at several of these items, including what the home ignition zone is, some resources that would be available to you that are related to fire resistant plants. We're going to talk about some of the basic principles of design, placement, and maintenance in the landscape. And then just some real basics about fire behavior. I think it's important to point out that I am a horticulturist. I am not a fire science professional. And so really my focus is on plant material and the placement of plant material and those types of things. If you start asking or you have questions that are more related to overall wide scale or broad scale fire management, those are going to be questions we'll have to put you in touch with a different type of specialist, because I don't have that experience or knowledge. So when I've been in this position since 1999, and when I got here in the early years, I started collecting articles about the wildfires that were going on. Myself and our forestry agent were collaborating on some of these Firewise plant types of presentations. And so I started collecting articles. And at first it seemed like they were somewhat sporadic. Some years we would have more than others. But then as the years started to roll on over the past 2 decades, I felt like I was collecting more and more articles. It seemed like a weekly news story was popping up somewhere in the West about the wildfires. And I thought, oh my goodness, I actually got to a point where I stopped collecting because there was just so many articles about it. But what was interesting along the way is to see the number of wildfires, not only in the wildland urban interface that were popping up, but also the articles that were popping up from urban environments. Like, for example, this one back in LA, we started to see some wildfires in Oregon as well, in the Portland area in the early 2000s. I think there was an example of one where a passing train sparked some vegetation along the railway, and it kind of raced uphill towards some homes in Portland. But anyway, unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of a need to be paying attention to not only Firewise landscaping, but also waterwise landscaping and the combination of the two. So I don't spend a lot of time in today's presentation talking about the statistics and the numbers, but I did want to point out a website that's available to you called the National Interagency Fire Center. And if you have an interest in knowing the number of acreages, which ones were human caused, those kinds of things, then it would be interesting for you to check out this website, because you're going to be able to look up that information. You're going to be able to pull it up by state reports and that sort of thing. So go ahead and check out or write down this National Interagency Fire Center. Oh, and that reminds me, I do have a PDF of this presentation that I can put into the, load it up into the chat, maybe at the end of the presentation, or have it send it over and it can be sent out to you, all the participants later. So if you want some of these notes, you can have a hard copy of that, or an electronic copy, to take with you, and you can print it out if you need to. So know that all of the text slides, are going to be in that presentation handout for you. So here's another example of one that was an urban wildfire where unfortunately 11 homes were lost. This is in the Ashland area back in 2010. And just to give you an idea of, this one actually started, this is the main highway here. And you can see this one started across the street. It was sparked by an individual, human caused, and caught fire, and it actually hopped the interstate, going over and hitting a row of homes across the interstate. And unfortunately, the way the homes were arranged and the types of plant material surrounding these homes, it was Leland cypress, it ended up burning 11 of these homes. And it was predominantly because of that type of plant material that was surrounding these homes that was very flammable. And so even the urban environments, it's hard to imagine, but even the urban environments are prone to wildfire damage. More recent research came out. This is interesting, and I haven't even had a chance to really dive in and read the whole report, but this just came out in February. But more than 60% of cross-boundary fires were ignited on private property, and only 28% originated in the national forest. I put the website link in here. And again, you can take a look at this article. So this is a researcher at OSU that found that, I think they looked at 22,000 fires and did the stats on it. And I thought this was really interesting because often the narrative we hear, or we've been hearing for a long time, is that most of the wildfires originate in the national forest, when in fact, it looks like, according to this research, that 60% are ignited on private property. So that just tells me that we have a role to play in trying to minimize the number of fires that get started. So a few basics about fire behavior in general. You have 3 elements that you need in order to have fire. You need heat, you need oxygen, and you need a fuel source. If you take any one of these 3 elements away, then the fire goes out. Fire behavior, the 3 elements of fire behavior are weather, topography, and fuel. So if you change one of the elements, this affects the behavior of the fire. It either affects the intensity of the fire or the rate of spread. For example, with weather, as we know, if the wind picks up, it's going to increase the rate of the spread. It's going to spread faster. So if you were to put these 2 side by side, the elements you need in order to have a fire and the different elements that affect fire behavior, you can see the common denominator between these 2 is going to be fuel. And thankfully, that's the one element we can influence. So we're going to focus primarily on that today as far as it relates to fuel in the landscape. And when I'm talking about fuel for today's presentations, I'm talking about anything that burns: trees, shrubs, structures, wood piles, wood fences, wood decks, those types of things. There are 3 ways that a fire can start. The first way being direct contact. If you have plant material that is touching a roof line or the side of your home and it's on fire, that direct contact can start your home on fire. This is an image from the Skeleton Fire, which took place in southern Deschutes County and south of Bend, 1996. You've got radiant heat is the second way. So you've got direct contact can start a fire on a structure. You've got radiant heat, which this was an experiment done by Jack Cohen. Jack Cohen's a well-known fire scientist, now retired. He did a lot of experimentation. He wanted to see how far away something can be lit on fire to actually cause radiant heat to light a structure on fire. And he found it could be as far away as 100 feet. You can have a fire source as far away as 100 feet and start a structure on fire just from the radiant heat alone. And then the third way that fires can ignite a structure or a home would be embers. And we're actually seeing that as being a primary cause of fires as well. Often what will happen with the embers is they can fly quite a distance from vegetative material and they will end up hitting either wood bark mulch in the landscape, or they can go in through the ventilation system in a home and start a fire in an attic space or the ventilation system. So when looking at ways to reduce fuel loads, the top 2 determinants in whether or not a home would or a structure would burn down on a fire had to do with the defensible space surrounding the home and how good that was, and then the use of non-combustible roofing and siding materials. Those came out as the top 2 determinants in whether or not a home would burn in a wildfire. So focusing in a little bit on what's called the home ignition zone. These are going to be the areas surrounding a home. And some of you may live in an area that doesn't even have this big of a space, but you could still apply the same principles to the smaller space. If you're on even a 1/2 acre lot, or if you're on a 1/4 acre lot, which some of you may be if you're in the city of Bend or somewhere, because some of the lots, our sizes aren't terribly big, but that's okay. You can still apply some of these same principles, as best you can. So the immediate zone is going to be this zone that's just 0 to 5 feet from the structure. And ideally, you're not putting any plant material up against the home in this 0 to 5 foot zone. Usually the immediate zone and the intermediate zones are going to be the two zones that have irrigation within them. And so the immediate zone or intermediate zone is 5 to 30 feet. So basically the first 0 to 30 feet from outside the structure or your home, you're going to want to have irrigation if possible. And you're going to want to be really thoughtful in how you're putting plant material in. The first 0 to 5 feet, ideally, no plant material, no wood bark mulch, those types of things. If you want to have maybe a container garden a little bit on the patio surrounding that with annuals or something, that's probably okay, or some vegetables. But generally speaking, you want to avoid a lot of plant material and the arrangement of the plant material. Going into the 5 to 30 foot intermediate zone, you can go ahead and start to put some plant material in. But again, we're going to discuss ways to put that plant material in and what that should look like. And then from 30 feet all the way out to 100 feet, this is where you start to maybe see a transitional area if you're on a larger lot where you would be starting to see some of the native vegetation creep in, and it would just be about keeping that, again, that arrangement and the number of plant material, how to have those spaced out and arranged so that you're not going to be conveying continuous fuel back to the home or structures around the home. And then beyond the 100 foot is going to generally be a native environment, and it's just about keeping that well maintained as well if you have that much area to that you are managing. So really to be thinking about that intermediate zone, 5 to 30 feet, removing what's called ladder fuels, and I'll talk about those in a minute, clearing any vegetation that's excessive, and keeping the lawn, or if there's native grasses in the area you live in, to 4 inches or lower. Once you start getting to 6 inches, 10 inches, 12, then it's possible if those vegetation materials were to catch on fire, they're going to be able to convey flames higher and start to potentially cause more damage. So here's some examples of tree spacing, you know, that 5 foot zone again, nothing there. But once you start to get out, then, you know, here are some recommendations. And again, this handout will be available to you. And you can also go to this website that will have some of the same imaging. But the trees or the clumps of trees should have a minimum of 18 feet between the treetops if possible. So again, if you're on a smaller lot, then you're not going to have that many trees potentially in your area if you're going to try and maintain the spacing. But that's to take into account mature size, which is often an overlooked component of landscaping, right? When we go to the nursery, we're excited, we buy these plants and they look really little in the pot when we get them, but you want your landscape to look full. So you go and you put a bunch of stuff in the landscape well, in 5 to 10 years, then a lot of that material fills in, and all of a sudden you kind of got a continuous border, or you've got a continuous canopy from your trees. And this is what you want to try to think about if you're designing for Firewise landscape, that you're spacing some of this out so that you can have a few things together, but you want to make sure you've got pretty good space in between, 18 foot in between these tree canopies in that first intermediate zone here, 5 to 30 feet. As you get further out, the tree canopy can get a little bit closer together, but the idea is that you're limbing up and pruning up, trying to reduce fuels that below the trees or at the base of trees. And then as you get even further out, the trees can become closer together. Just a close-up of that. So other things to be thinking about in that intermediate zone, that 5 to 30 foot zone, is the horizontal spacing, not to overlook that. So for example, if you like a variety of shrubs, and ideally you would want a shrub border, the recommendation would be not to create a shrub border that's going to be continuous, because if it was to catch on fire, then you're going to have this fuel line that's continuous fuel source or potential flames that can be maintaining that heat source for too long. And so for shrubs, for this example, you would want to remove make sure there's enough room between the shrubs so that if one did catch on fire, that it wouldn't be able to preheat or catch the next one on fire. So for example, you would take out these two shrubs in this example. So apply these spacing rules so that you're eliminating that continuum of fuel. So the general rule of thumb is 2 times the width of the plant. So if you've got, for example, a shrub that spreads to 3 feet total, you want to put the next shrub 6 foot away from that shrub so that you're allowing for mature size, and then you're going to have at least several feet of space in between those plants at maturity. Limbing and pruning, as we talked about, as you get further out, you want to, number one, you want to make sure you're keeping the weeds down, the grasses down. If you have a turf grass area, all of that, you want to keep 4 inches or lower. And then if you have plant material directly under your trees, whether they be native trees or trees you put in, ideally you're removing and you're limbing up those trees 3 times to whatever it would be underneath those trees. So this is going to be more applicable once you get out beyond that 30 feet and you're getting out to that 100-foot area on larger lots. But you can see here, so you would be taking out that top limb right there in this example, if you happen to have shrubs underneath that. Again, so just, just to be preventive here and conveying those flames, if that shrub below conveys those flames and you have it limbed up, hopefully the flame wouldn't be able to preheat or catch the lowest limbs on those trees on fire, starting a crown fire. So you want to, the general recommendation is to prune trees up to at least 10 feet above the ground to reduce what's called ladder fuels. And these are going to be the fuels that are down below that convey these flames. Those are good side by side. You can see the one on the left is going to be one that would need some work done. You'd want to clear out some of the items below it, and you can see there's a lot of dead limbs attached to that tree. You want to go ahead and remove those limbs. You want it to be looking more like what you see on the right here, where it's been limbed up several feet, and then you can see a lot of the materials from below have been completely removed. So ladder fuels are what's known, it's the vegetation that you have from the ground going up, that if the height's close enough together, it's going to allow that surface fire to become a crown fire. And so it's usually this intermediate plant material. It's typically shrubs, taller grasses, things like that, smaller trees if they're newer landscape material that are in that stage of usually a foot all the way up to 4 or 5 feet that can convey these flames up to the higher canopies of a tree. So you want to be thoughtful in designing your landscape, or if you have existing plant material, and how that fuel is arranged and what that looks like. For example, in this photo, you can see these trees down here near the base of this tall pine tree. Those would be considered ladder fuels. And if they were to catch on fire, if it started as a ground fire, then that could potentially start to convey some of this flames all the way up these trees to the intermediate trees and all the way up to the top of the tree canopy. This photo is a home that was in the area here south of Bend in the skeleton fire. This is a home that survived the skeleton fire. This homeowner actually had done some work around the home to be preventative. They had created some defensible space around their home. Unfortunately, right up against the home, they had some juniper, and you can see what's burned out here in this example. What's left here in the middle lower part of the screen. You can see, let's see if I can show this a little better. Well, anyway, here in the lower part of the screen down here, you can see that is where there was some ornamental juniper that they created a hedge. And unfortunately, in this case, an ember flew in and hit the ornamental juniper, and it started the fire. And so that was the source of what started this one. And let's see here. And the flame came in and hit the fire, and because of that, it started to light the side of the home on fire as well. And so you had an ember come in, it started to light the ornamental juniper, which are very flammable, and it went up and around the home, conveying the flames to the side of the home, and you can see it at the rooftop. The reason that this home survived the wildfire is because the firefighters were nearby and were able to come in and help put the fire out quickly. Topography plays a role. So depending on whether you're on a flat lot or if you happen to be at the base of a hill, it's important to know that topography does play a role in how quickly a fire can spread. You know, on flat ground, you can see with the heat and the smoke plume that the heat is just going to go straight up. Whereas if you have a slope, particularly a steep slope, then it's going to allow those flames to preheat the fuels above that fire and allow it to burn more quickly uphill. So that you want to be thinking about if you're upslope, especially from a native plant area, you want to be thinking about how to clear that out again in that first 0 to 30 feet from the that intermediate zone in particular. You want to be clearing that out. So this is an example of a home that went ahead and cleared out around their home. You can see they removed a lot of the plant material. They kind of spaced it out here. And so this area right in the middle where they have this rock bed that they've started to develop, they would be able to go ahead and put some fire resistant type plant material in that bed to add some ornamental value landscape to their home. But if they space it out correctly and the way that they designed this, they would be helping with that defensible space. You also want to be thoughtful of what's upslope behind the home as well. But more importantly, you want to be focused on the downslope areas. Here are some suggested distances for reducing fuels around home, depending on what type of slope you have surrounding your home. Other things you want to be thinking about surrounding the home is your decking material. And if your deck is raised up and you want to be thinking about screening under the decking material, for example, you know, this may be a way to keep out some critters and that sort of thing, but you would still have a lot of plant debris collecting under there. If you have conifers in the area, you would have conifer needles collecting under there. So really this screening material is probably not sufficient in really keeping this fuel free unless you're going in and routinely cleaning out underneath it. But you'd want something that's actually a little more efficient in that as a screening material. Here's another example of a home that was successful in creating a defensible space around the home. This is again is an example from the skeleton fire. And you can see that, I'm not sure what year this photo was taken because I got this from a colleague, but I think this, I'm not sure if it was taken in 1996 or if it was taken the following year, but you can see the wildfire move through and scorched all the material around the home, but the home survived. And the reason why this home survived is number one, it had non-combustible roofing and siding material, so that was helpful, and that the radiant heat didn't light it up on fire. And then secondly, they had a defensible space where they had a break with the turf grass area. And as ponderosa pine mature, they can become more fire resistant. It's not that they won't burn, but as their bark thickens over time, they become a little more fire resistant. So what was interesting about this is it looks like everything burned pretty well, but to the right of the slide, there was a home to the right of the slide that almost burned down completely. But so a lot of other plant material and structures in this area did burn. But then there was a follow-up photo taken, and this is 7 years after the fire in 2003. And you can just see, I just think it's interesting to see, really of note, what I find interesting is, let's see here, is, you know, you've got these ponderosa pine that survived that wildfire. And what that means is, even though the ponderosa pine, you know, if we go back here, you can see those are the pine here, even though they look like they burned, there were buds that survived. So even though the current foliage, the pine needles on the pine did burn, there were buds that survived the wildfire. And so they were able to bud out and continue to grow after the wildfire, which is interesting. I also find it interesting just to look at the number of trees that were in the wildfire that burned prior, and then again to take a look at what we have here going forward 7 years. You can see, so then they put in some new plant material, and you can see some smaller trees and shrubs in through here. Like they may have an ornamental pond back here, and you can see an irrigated zone. You can see the water was running here, an irrigated zone in the front of the home as well, and some new plant material. And this is actually from 2021. This is the same home. And just interesting to see how those plants filled in. So to me, this is just a good reminder. They have some fire resistant plant material here on the back part of this, but you can just kind of see how the natural landscape has filled in over time too, and how those ponderosa pine are doing. But just a good reminder on how these plants mature. Because if you go back here, actually I have it kind of set up this way, you can kind of see from the 3 different photos how those smaller plants in the 2003 photo, how those really fill in over time. And so that's a good reminder, and you just really do want to, and I would say that these look like they're getting pretty close together, and you've got some conifers now maybe in that intermediate zone that they're going to continue to get bigger and larger. And so you want to be thoughtful in just your placement and that sort of thing. I think right now I'm just gonna, so before we start to talk about characteristics of fire resistant plants, I'm going to see if there's anything in the Q&A that I can answer before we kind of switch gears here. So let me see if I can. May I share the PDF with my neighborhood of 30 properties? Definitely, yeah, that's not a problem. Okay. So there's different definitions of what fire resistance means. There's an ecological definition where it means the ability for a plant to persist in a plant community after a fire has gone through. With, you know, for example, plants like tan oak means a wildfire has gone through, and what seeds or what roots, or for example, the ponderosa pine is buds survived their persistence after a wildfire has gone through. You know, you have the whole ecology of what plants come up first post fire. You know, for example, something like fireweed would come up quickly after. But for purposes of this talk, that's not the definition we're using for fire resistance. What we're using for purposes of this talk is going to be the ability of a plant to resist ignition and not sustain continued combustion. So I think it's really important to note that fire resistant plants does not mean fireproof. And that can't be overstated. There's no such thing as a fire resistant plant, truly. It just means the plant is not going to necessarily sustain a flame for a long period of time, or that it burns really hot because it's got volatile oils in it, or it throws flames really far and high. And so it's not that the plant won't burn, it's just that usually it burns quickly and doesn't stay lit up for very long. So that's what we're talking about for this presentation. We're talking about fire resistant plant material. And again, it's fire resistant, it's not fireproof. So let's cover some things about highly flammable plants. And these are going to be plants that contain dead or dry material, particularly as they mature. They may have, just the way that their growth habit is, their characteristics of how they grow, they collect debris within and don't normally exfoliate them well. Unless you're going out there and manually removing all of that, then you're going to have a plant that's going to have a lot more fuel source than some other plants. It could be plants that have volatile oils, waxes, terpenes that are naturally present in the plant. You see some of this with some of your conifers in particular, like pine and spruce. If the plant is aromatic in particular, that can be a sign that it's more flammable and less fire resistant. If the sap is sticky, resinous, has a really strong odor to it, again, another sign that there's probably some oils in there or some type of chemistry in that plant that's going to be more flammable. Some plants have the characteristics, for example, birch, that may have more loose or papery bark or what's called exfoliating bark over time. That's just a part of the growth habit of the plant and how it matures. And those would be characteristics of more fire-prone plants and something to avoid. So here's an example of what you might see, a classic juniper hedge that somebody puts up for screening or privacy. But if you were to, cut away that plant, then you would see how a lot of these needles or debris collect within the plant. And so you want to avoid these types of plants to be in that first 0 to 5 feet for sure. And then be very thoughtful if you're going to include plants like that in the intermediate zone, that you're really not putting a cluster of them together, and ideally not including these fire-prone plants at all in that intermediate zone. Here's another close-up of what that looks like. You can see everything that fell out when these plants got pruned. And not only that, here's another list of some fire-prone plants to avoid. This list is pretty specific to the Central Oregon region. But just to give you an idea of ones that would be considered more fire-prone. Bitterbrush is one of our natives. So, there's often the challenge when you're selecting plant material. I will get requests from people. They want a plant that is Firewise and water-wise and deer resistant and ideally native. And unfortunately, there's not really that silver bullet list of plants. So it really comes back to prioritizing what are your goals in your landscape? What is the priority here? If the priority is Firewise, then you need to look for Firewise, and you may not necessarily get Firewise that's also native, that's also deer resistant, that's also drought tolerant. Now, there's going to be some of those that cross over. You may be able to find a handful of plants that meet all those goals for you, but you're not going to have a really large list of plant material that's going to cover all those goals. And so I tell folks when they have requests like that from me, I say, you've got to prioritize what is the landscape goals for you, because something's going to have to take precedent, because there's really not like this giant list of plants that are going to hit all those check marks for you, unfortunately. And bitterbrush is an example. Like, this is a really important plant for wildlife and forage and habitat, but unfortunately it's a fire-prone plant. So it's a trade-off there if you have to remove this for Firewise purposes. Here's arborvitae. I put this one in because it's such a popular plant across the country for that matter, but recently saw this. Someone had pruned it, probably for safety purposes, adjacent to a driveway. It was probably sticking out over the sidewalk, so they pruned it up. And again, I just wanted you to see like all of the needles that collect the debris that collects within the interior of the arborvitae, because from the outside it looks really green and you wouldn't necessarily think this to be a fire-prone plant. But from the inside, you can see there's a lot of dead material that has accumulated there over time. And the other part about this is, now that it's been pruned improperly, because this is not the right way to prune arborvitae, they actually really don't need pruning. They're self-maintained. And when you prune back this far into old wood, you're not really, it's not that this is going to come back green again. When you prune back that far into plants that don't like pruning this far, then generally you've pruned past any real new growing points. And so you're just going to have dead branches everywhere you pruned, where you pruned back to, if you have any of these branches left and sticking out. So it's kind of a double whammy. You can, now you've kind of created more dead and dry wood as that wood dries out where you pruned. On the right here, you've got mugo pine. I just am showing this to see what it looks like after it's been burned. Excuse me. It's complete consumption from the fire. And so if you think about the needles that would have been covering a mugo pine, how long that would have burned for to be able to burn it completely like this. That would be a long hot fire as far as a fuel source in a wildfire. And here on the bottom picture, you can see the fir tree branches touching the roof line. Again, fir tree is going to have oils in it that's going to sustain a flame a lot longer than a fire resistant plant, potentially allowing that fire to burn longer and hotter. So switching gears, we go from what some characteristics are fire prone plants to here are some characteristics for fire resistant plants. So generally speaking, you're going to have your deciduous trees that have more of a broad leaf to them. There are some thick leaf evergreens like rhododendron and that sort of plant that can be included as fire resistant, but generally it's more of a thinned deciduous type leaf that's going to be more fire resistant. Those leaves tend to be more moist, supple. You can kind of easily crush them. If you were to take the leaf and kind of crush it in your hand, it's going to be more easily crushed than material, meaning it has more moisture content inside of it. Those are going to be some characteristics of fire resistant plants. They tend to stay clean, not collect dead wood over time, meaning either they don't have just natural wood that dies out over time, which you can sometimes see in certain plants, or then when the leaves come off or the needles come off, that they come off cleanly and they don't accumulate within the plant material. For shrubs, you want to be looking at some of the more low growing shrubs instead of those medium sized shrubs that are in that 6 to 10 foot range. You want to be looking at shrubs that are maybe more compact, more low growing. The sap or even the leaf or foliage material doesn't typically have a strong odor in fire resistant plants. It's more water-like. And so that can be another cue for something that is more fire resistant. And so the idea is that you're looking for these types of plants and you're looking for something that's going to help break up if a fire was running through your landscape, break up the fuel ladders. So again, you're just thinking about the arrangement of the plant material, the numbers in the plant material, that actual design, and being really thoughtful and where plants are placed or how they're, where they currently exist and if that's a safe placement. Another item that can't be overstated is how the plants are maintained. If they're not well maintained, then they become less fire resistant and they become more fire prone. So if you have a plant, but it's not sufficiently being watered or cared for, and so part of it is dead, even though it's a fire resistant plant, if you have one side of it where there's some dead branches, of course, it becomes more fire prone. If the plant is well maintained and it's considered a fire resistant plant, the value in that is, for example, with this Delosperma species, which is commonly known as hardy ice plant, it can actually slow down the fire because of the moisture content in the leaves. They shorten the flame length if a fire is moving through and reduce the amount of heat. And so they can actually be somewhat of a shield or just help mitigate the fire in a good way if they're well maintained. Oh, just a note of interest. This is not, for those of you that may be from another area, this is not the ice plant that's considered invasive in the California region, for example. It's a totally different genus. They just happen to both be called ice plant, but this one is non-invasive and actually a super choice for fire resistant plant material in our region. So again, the condition of the plants is really, really important that you're maintaining them. Here's an example of basket of gold, which is the yellow blooming plant. You've got some flax, you've got some aspen. All of these would be considered fire resistant plants. But again, you want to make sure they're well maintained. You can see a little bit of damage on the right side of that aspen trunk. Yeah, I don't know what the above part looks like, but if, you know, that'd be something you want to be looking at and make sure the plant is staying healthy. And here's another example. This is just the front of a home in an urban environment, a small lot. I just wanted you to kind of take a minute and think about what are you seeing in this photo, just from some of the things we've talked about already today, that maybe bonuses and maybe good things, or maybe not so good things in creating that defensible space around your home. So just take a minute here. Here's a close up. So I see maybe one good thing in this landscape, and then I see a few things that maybe aren't so good. So one, unfortunately, the pruning on this spruce, and these are cultivated spruce that are supposed to look ornamental. And I understand some people prefer this well maintained. These spruce kind of crack me up. They remind me of like a lollipop or a popsicle. So it's called, I call them sprucicles. But the sprucicle, unfortunately, it was pruned pretty far back into the old wood, just like with the arborvitae, and generally speaking, they won't recover from this. There's usually no growing points that far back into the wood. So they're probably going to end up having this dead spot, this dead area, and that'll probably actually spread out a little bit with the way it's been pruned. So they just kind of increase the amount of dead wood within this plant. Secondly, hopefully you noted just that spruce usually have that fragrant odor if you crush the needles, and to the left, you can see the Nugo pine, same thing. You're going to have two plants here that both have some oils in them that are going to be very flammable. You've got dead wood. And of course, you can see how close they are to a wood deck on the home. And so these are all potential problems with creating that defensible space around the home. Probably the one item I see, or there's two, you could go back here, is one, they do have a field break with some turf grass area, and they do have some, looks like some red mulching material around, which is going to be a more fire safe mulching material around the home instead of a wood bark mulch. They've got, looks like some red rock there. So some pros and some cons in this example. And again, they're in that 0 to 5 foot zone as well too, which is not ideal. Okay, we'll take a quick look here at the Q&A, because it looks like there's some questions that popped up before I go over this case study. Let's see here. I've got, what about ornamental junipers? What about juniper trees? So you're talking about, likely you're talking about our Western juniper, Juniper occidentalis. Yes, they are going to be highly flammable as well. Unfortunately, all the juniper in that genus are going to be flammable. So there's really not any that I can think of that should be, that is going to be fire resistant, unfortunately. So, okay, what is the scientific name for the non-invasive ice plant? I think it's, I'll have to look that up. It's, I want to say Calabrotus. It begins with a C, but I can't quite recall off the top of my head. So I'll have to think about that one. And let's see, the next question, what to do about potentially feed of pine needles and other forest stuff on a steep hill if the property below is not my property and within an HOA? Are there particular local nurses tend to offer good Firewise guidance and inventory for planning and purchasing? Yeah, hopefully for the question about what to do, you know, you want to be removing the layers of pine needles on your own property, of course. If it's somebody else's property, hopefully you can have a conversation with that property owner. I know sometimes that's easier said than done, but ideally you can do that. And if not, there are some, you know, in our Firewise Project Wildfire community, there may be some folks that can help facilitate that conversation, so that it's not necessarily you talking neighbor, if it's not going to be an easy conversation. there's some resources that you can reach out to that potentially could help facilitate that. And are the nurseries, I think some of the local nurseries are more well-versed in the Firewise plantings, and I'll point you to some resources at the end of guides that are available that can help you in purchasing fire-resistant plant material. Let's see. Yeah, so the ice plant Delosperma is going to be the one that is non-invasive. That's the one you want. It's the other ice plant by common name that is the one you want to avoid. Is there a list of Firewise plants for our landscaping? And I will talk about those shortly here. So yeah, there's some resources available to you. Okay, let's head back to the case study. This is Aubrey Butte Fire in Bend 2007. I don't know if some of you folks were living in the area when this one happened, but they were doing some construction on Aubrey Butte, some building, and unfortunately cutting through some metal piping, some sparks flew and caught the native vegetation on fire. So a spark flew and started to light some of the native vegetation on fire. And then because of the topography, it started to, in the wind, it started to race uphill. And you can see this is a view from where that wildfire was, and you can see the proximity to several homes. And the wind started to push it over to the right around this home. There's another view of that. Scary fire so close to homes. But this is the aftermath of what you can see burned here. And so this is a good example of how a wildfire can affect plant material and the landscape. So these are mugo pines that you're seeing. Let's see if I can kind of annotate this for you. So this right here, this is going to be a mugo pine that was mostly consumed. Same here. This was a mugo pine and some of the native vegetation outside of here. Let's see. So here's another view, and you can see again, you've got some conifers that were consumed. Those look like some sort of spruce. And then you can start to see, we'll get a little closer here, but there's actually some bubbling on the paint here from the radiant heat from the fire itself. You can see in the foreground here, let me annotate that for you. This area right here in the foreground, these are cotoneasters. They're considered to be fire resistant. You can see that they don't look affected. You've got some other deciduous plant material here that wasn't affected. You can see all the conifers were primarily consumed here with the heat. Here's a close-up of what some of the radiant heat and how it affected the plant, or excuse me, affected the home. It's how it affected the paint and scorched. There's another view of that. And again, just look at the landscape material around. You've got a mix here of mostly conifers that burn, but this one in the foreground looks like a deciduous. Just another view here. In this one, you can see you've got the native plant material here, and then you've got this barrier. These are willows, and willows would be considered fire resistant type plants because of their foliage. And you've got some aspen trees here that are up around this plant surrounding this home. And again, here's the front view from that. So again, you've got the native in the foreground here. You've got some pine, and then you've got this shrub border of willows. The fire moved across in this direction, hit some of the conifers. But thankfully you had the fire resistant shrub border here that was helpful in this situation. You can see that it did scorch. Again, it's not fireproof, so it did scorch, but it was actually more like a shield and was able to kind of deflect some of that heat as it burned these willows. And thankfully that was the case because, again, let me show you an example here. So this is Mugo pine right behind this, closest to the home. The home's here. So that would have been unfortunate if this had breached. Thankfully, you can see that the top of this willow, this is the outside, actually did burn. You can see some of the burn even came through here, but thankfully it didn't get too far into the Mugo pine before the firefighters were able to put it out. So in this case, you can see how a fire resistant plant was helpful in kind of deflecting or at least preventing it from getting to here. And when they were, the firefighters were able to put it out in time, it just started to scorch some of this Mugo. And had this caught fire, that would have been a hotter fire to put out. Sure. Also, what burned around this particular home were these aspen. Again, right in the foreground here, you can see a Mugo pine that completely burned, but then you have these aspen that were able to deflect and kind of shield some of the heat from the home. Those are Mugo pines that are circled there. And they conveyed some heat up to these aspen. The aspen were able to kind of shield some of that heat from the home. Okay, so here's an example. This is a retired fire chief's home in Deschutes County, in southern Deschutes County. And so it was built, and the landscape was designed to be a Firewise landscape and create that defensible space. And so non-combustible materials for the building materials, but then also making sure that very low growing plant material around this deck. And again, the building materials are non-combustible, and then he's included some hardscaping with some rock material, and hardscaping is always nice to have in a Firewise landscape, so they don't really burn. Some low growing plant material, mostly ground covers, big fuel break in that intermediate zone with fire resistant plant choices in a turf grass area, which is turf grass is has a high percentage of moisture content in it, so it actually is really effective in slowing down fire from the ground. And then as you move further out, you can see now this starts to become more of the native vegetation area, and that's a good distance out away from the home. Got some native shrubs in there. So it's like a willow here. He also included a man-made pond there just to have some water as a source in case that would be needed during a wildfire. There'd be a water source on site. And then this is from the side of this home, just to show you in the native plant area how it's been limbed up, cleared out below, thinned out. So there's a break there. So if you're looking at some of these, you're thinking, gosh, where do I even start? You know, you could have this checklist. There's several different publications out there that have checklists on kind of what to do. And you can just start to go through that checklist, but really predominantly removing any weeds or dead grasses, mowing things to 4 inches or less is a good way to start. Replacing mulching material that may be combustible with non-combustible mulching material like gravel or rock, or you can use really fine compost that's phenomenal, just fine particled compost. Clearing your roofs, your decks, your gutters of pine needles and debris, making sure none of the limbs are touching your roof line. Those are some ways to start. As far as resources available, the current resource that we have available through OSU is called Fire Resistant Plants for Home Landscapes. And it's a pictorial plant guide. There's the website link for it. This guide we put out in 2006, and so I'm actually in the process of the revision of this plant guide. There's some dated information in this one as far as the home ignition zone they've since research has shown a little bit of a shift in the recommendations there. And so there's a little bit of dated material in the introductory part of this publication, which is why we're doing a revision to include the most current research and to include since there has been some more research on fire resistance in plants. And so I've added some plant material to the guide, but this is available electronically online. We have a few hard copies left in our office, but we haven't printed them because the revision's we've been working on that, and that will be out this year sometime. We're close to getting that final revision done. And so hopefully in the next few months, we'll have the new copy available to anyone that is interested. And this guide, it's predominantly the pictorial plant guide. Let's see here. Might be able to, I'll wait till I'm done with the presentation to bring that up and show you what that looks like. But well, there's an inside page. And so it's going to just list the plant material by common and scientific name, list some characteristics of the plant material, some suggested cultivars, and then the water use, the sunlight requirements, whether or not it attracts pollinators or birds, whether or not it's deer resistant, if it's recommended for rock gardens. There's some different characteristics listed in there that you can use that for. And it has perennials, trees, and shrubs in it. If you want to do your own search online for a list of fire resistant plants, you can just do a Google search where you type in fire resistant plants, and then the key is to put in site:/edu, and that'll bring up university sites, which is going to bring up the research-based sites for fire resistant plants. The reality is there is not a lot of research on fire resistant plant material. And part of that is just because of the expense involved with what it would take to do extensive research. If you can imagine, in order to do good research, you'd have to have a lot of plant material, and then you'd be destroying that plant material over and over again to get some of the outcomes that you're looking for in the research. So when you do a search, there's actually a very small body of work that's been done on true fire resistance and plant materials, and in particular ornamental plant materials, what you would find in nurseries. There's more research available on native plant materials that you're going to find in forested and woodland areas. But there has been a little bit more done since this August 2006 publication came out, and so I'll point you to some of that. The other reason why this type of research is difficult is because it can't be replicated easily. So if you have, for example, penstemon that you're trying to test a penstemon out for fire resistance in a landscape, that penstemon and the way it grows in Central Oregon is going to be very different than that way that penstemon grows in Colorado, as far as, because the soil types are going to be different. And so the way that it holds moisture in the leaves is all related to elevation and soil type. And so when you're measuring moisture content and you're measuring the chemistry of the plant material itself, and you're looking at the mineral content and those things, all of those are impacted by environment. There's environmental influences that are going to change it. And even though it's the exact same plant genetically, those environmental influences are going to change those details of that plant or the characteristics of those plants. And so it's really hard to definitively say this plant that's fire resistant here is also going to be fire resistant over here, because it's not really that easy to come out with real solid research that's going to be able to support that. And so there's just some challenges involved with testing plants for fire resistance. Hopefully we can continue to go in that direction and find more of that, but right now there's not a lot of it available. So the ones that were included in this guide, this list, were ones that I was able to find research on that was actually tested for fire resistance, and there was implications there for fire resistance with these plants. If there's no research on that a plant, then I did not include it in this guide. If you're from outside the area, there is a guide for the Willamette Valley you could utilize that was written using fire resistant plant characteristics were included. The plants included in this had fire resistant plant characteristics. Idaho came out with this, and you can access this. This one's called Fire Resistant Plant Master Database, and this is where they did some research on a variety of ornamental plants. It's one of the few research studies that have been done on more ornamental plant material. And so the guide's pretty extensive as far as the number of plants it's included. And this is just to show you, and one of the pages looks like. What they do is they've tested the plant material, and what they were looking for in their research was mineral content, moisture content, volatile oil content. And then they were using those to determine what they called a fire resistance score. And you can see, for example, on this one, so for example, for the, let's use Kinnick as an example, they gave this one a fire resistance score of 5. And if you were to go up here, a fire resistance score of 5 would tell you this is how far out from the home you'd want to use a plant with that type of fire resistance score. So the ones that have a fire resistance score of 8, 9, or 10 are going to be the most fire resistant plants. And as the number goes down, its fire resistance goes down as well. And so this is a good list to look at. As you can see, there's a lot of cultivated varieties on this list. And so it may be useful to you in that way. And there's a fair amount of plants on this list that are applicable to Central Oregon. I've reviewed this list, and some of these plants that are on this list will be included in a new pictorial plant guide that we're coming out with. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to transition and just cover some of the fire resistant plants that can be used here in Central Oregon. Well, yeah, I think I'll go through these first, and then let's see, it's 11:08. I'll go through these first, and then I'll take a look at the Q&A, and we'll wrap up with questions there. So dappled willow is one of the ones. This is a popular willow with a variegated leaf. And again, all of these are in that fire resistant plant guide that is currently available. I also have a Waterwise guide for Central Oregon. That's a pictorial plant guide. And in there is an icon for designated plants that are considered to be fire resistant. And so you could also look at that guide, because that's going to have a little more, it's more current. It's only 5 years old. And so that guide actually includes some additional fire resistant plants in it that are, the guide's focus is Waterwise gardening, but I've included plants that are fire resistant in there, and they're designated as such. But I start with just some sample plants that you can look at here, and these are going to be ones that are considered fire resistant. And I start with the lowest growing ground cover. So this one, for example, is called Snow in Summer. It's a ground cover that likes full sun, drought tolerant, gets white flowers on it when it's in bloom in the springtime. And again, you could use something like this. You would not want to put this up against the home, but you could use something like this further out in the intermediate area, and it will spread and fill in the area in. So you just want to make sure that you don't have it a continuum of fuel there, but you can use it in small planting beds or areas where you have groupings of plants. You're close up with the blossom there. Creeping phlox is going to be the one that's in bloom in pink here. And most people are familiar with creeping phlox. That comes in a variety of flower colors. And one of our early blooming spring ground covers here. It comes in whites and kind of pale blues and pinks and purples. This variety is called Candy Stripe. And both the snow and summer and the creeping phlox are supposed to be deer resistant. I use that word kind of hesitantly because it depends on each winter whether or not deer will nibble on something, but they're generally more deer resistant. Here's two different types of sedum. We've got one on the right and one on the left here. Sedums are going to be a great choice for fire resistant landscaping because they hold a lot of moisture content. They're more like succulent types of plants. And so there's a wide variety of low growing sedum. And there's some taller ones too, if you want some intermediate sized ones. There's a close up of this one. It has a variegated leaf to it. And there's a close up of this one that has a leaf that has tinged in red and gets a pink flower. And so they do get flowers, but they're predominantly grown just for their succulent foliage in the landscape during the rest of the season. I've mentioned this one a few times. This is a nice one, the Delosperma. There's a lot of different flower color choices. Some are more hardy than others, but you can see this one's kind of a pale pink, kind of peach colored. There's a hardy yellow ice plant, and you can see they do really well in hot, dry conditions, so they're a nice choice, and they have that succulent foliage. There's purple, there's red, a lot of nice choices out there. Pine leaf penstemon is going to be the one that's in bloom here. That's going to be one of our natives. And it's one of the longest blooming perennials you can use here. It'll actually bloom for about 6 weeks. Close up with the foliage and the flower. And again, there's some cultivated varieties that are yellow or more peach colored. Richardson's penstemon is going to be another one of our native penstemon that you could use here. And we've got several different native penstemon and also a lot of cultivated penstemon that can be used. Again, there's a little bit of range there on cold hardiness and adaptability, and so some are more hardy than others. Yarrow is going to be a taller perennial, and there's some cultivated varieties that are less apt to spread. Some of the yarrow is quite aggressive and can really fill an area in, so you'll want to be careful in your selection. I mentioned in the pictorial plant guide which ones are less often or less likely to spread or fill in. This is our native yarrow. It will fill an area in, but it has a white blooming flower on it. Blue flax is another native that can be used that's fire resistant. And that one will reseed. So again, you'll need to manage it, but it's one that you can be using a little further out. Sunrose can be used, and that one will come in a variety of different flower options. Lower growing one. There's a close up of that bloom, likes full sun. Daylilies, real common perennial, and of course these come in a wide variety of colors, but that can be a nice option for fire resistant plants. That one, this is a close up of Stella Diora, is one of the cultivated varieties that's more long blooming. Full sun for those as well. I could do some part shade. Red hot poker is one that can be used here in Central Oregon. Other parts of the country may be invasive, but here we don't see that. And it's a nice fire resistant plant. Close up with a blossom. And there's some different choices there as well. Yucca is one of our more drought tolerant. You can see it's planted here in a rock garden type area. Again, this one, you know, there's some maintenance involved. Sometimes the foliage dies back. You'll want to make sure you keep that cleaned out. Carol Mackey Daphne, a little less adaptable here, but certain parts of Central Oregon, you can get this to grow successfully. It has a really amazing fragrant flower to it, but has more moisture content in the leaf. we don't have a lot of Daphne that work in this region, so this is one of the more cold tolerant ones that can successfully be grown here. Those are close up of that foliage, variegated foliage in the blossom. Lilacs, just your general common lilac or some of the cultivated French lilacs that are a little smaller in size. This is the common purple, but you've got common white as well. Lilac's an interesting one because it's got this amazing fragrant ornamental bloom or blossom, but as they mature in the landscape, the longer they're in the landscape, they become more drought tolerant. So they start out kind of as a moderate water use plant, but then as they mature, they can become pretty drought tolerant. And in fact, I've witnessed some interesting areas of Bend over the years where I know of one example where there's one in an empty lot that has since been, the water's been turned off and there's been no water for many, many years in a commercial lot, and it still blooms every year. So it tells me it's adapted to no additional irrigation outside of the natural precipitation here. Pretty amazing. These ones on the right here are some of the French hybrids you can get. So that's a nice option for, again, that intermediate zone if you want some ornamental value. A close up on the blossom. Lewis's mock orange is another fragrant ornamental. This is our native mock orange. There's also some ornamental mock orange you can use. This one's great for attracting pollinators. You've got, and this one has more of a wild type growth habit. So again, if I was using something like this in the intermediate zone, it's not that you just wouldn't want to have several of them, but you could probably use this as one main plant and you could have some perennials around it and then make sure you have a big break or barrier between the next grouping or planting of plants. At least 10 to 15 feet. There's a close-up of that blossom. Red twig dogwood or Redossier dogwood is what it looks like when it's leafed out. Close-up of the flower. And there's a whole family of dogwoods that are similar, cultivated ones that are smaller in size. You can get some dwarf, like the Kelsey dogwood is much smaller, and dwarfer, which would be a good choice for keeping those lattifules low. And then of course you've got some really interesting winter texture in that the stems have a nice coloration to them. Western spirea is another medium-sized shrub. Again, it's not that you can't use these types of plants that are kind of medium size, like 4 to 6 foot. It's like you're being very thoughtful about placement and what's around it if you're going to use them. So this is one of our native spirea. Close up with the flower. This one prefers a little more moisture, even though it's native. And yellow fall color on that. And so something like this, as far as maintenance goes, you'll have these flower heads that'll die back, and I would go through and I'd be removing these flower heads as they become dry and brown. As far as moving into trees, deciduous trees, we've got the red maple hybrids are going to be a really good choice for this region. There's one example of those. Close up with the foliage. Aspen, one of our natives, can be used. You know, there are, if you bring aspen into an urban environment, they become a little less easy to manage, and they tend to become, they can be ones that you'll end up seeing some environmental damage to them. And so you just have to be thoughtful when you're placing them. But as far as a fast growing native, that would be aspen. And just make sure you're accounting for the fact that aspen are genetically geared to create groves. Excuse me, they're going to create groves and how they grow. So they're not going to be a single standing tree with one trunk. That's not how aspen work. They're going to fill in. Anyone that has aspen near or around their turf grass area or beds or has a neighbor with aspen know that this is true, that you're going to end up with sprouts coming up all over the place because they're intended to create growth. So they're not really ideal for a small lot, but full sun, drought tolerant can be a good choice depending on where you live and what your lot looks like for a fire resistant tree. There's a Swedish aspen. They're a little bit more narrow and they have a more upright, narrow growth habit and a serrated leaf, and they get a little bit different fall color. Again, they're not going to be free from suckering. You're still going to see them send up suckers, supposedly a little less on the Swedish aspen, but you're still going to see it create growths. Crab apples are going to be a great ornamental tree for a fire-resistant landscape. This one's called Spring Snow. It's one of the ones we have in our demonstration garden in Redmond. Just really nice growth habit. You get white blossoms, and this one's actually, you get very, very little fruit set on it. It's a sterile variety, so there's not really the messy crabapple fruit, just the blossoms in the spring. Close up of those blossoms. Here's another popular crabapple that's out right now. It has a different type of growth habit, more of a teardrop shaped growth habit. We have this one in our demonstration garden too. It's called Royal Raindrops, and pink flower is kind of a burgundy leaf color, stem color. It gets a nice fall color as well. Choke cherry, this is the native choke cherry. And you can see this is when it's in full bloom. It's multi-stem. There's a close-up of the blossoms, really fragrant blossoms, full sun. And then there's some cultivated varieties like Schubert choke cherry that leaves out green, but then the foliage turns red during the growing season. European mountain ash, and this is one that can be grown in Central Oregon. In other parts of the state or country, it may be considered invasive, but we don't see that here with it. There's the fruit set and the flower on the mountain ash. There's different cultivated varieties of this. And then we have serviceberry, which you can get in tree form, or there's native shrubs. And so the tree form looks like this. It's kind of a thinner canopy tree, so you can see why that would be a good choice for fire resistance. And it doesn't get as large as some of your shade trees. It just has a thinner canopy all the way around. And so here's a close-up of the flower. It's white blooming, and then you'll get some edible fruit set. If you're fast enough, you get there before the birds, you can actually use the serviceberry to make jams and jellies or wines, but usually the birds get to it first. And then you've got some really nice fall color on the serviceberry as well. I think this is an underused ornamental plant in our landscapes, either in the shrub form or tree form, that doesn't tend to have significant pest problems and just a pretty easy plant to grow. So, and that kind of brings me to the end of the presentation. And so what I'll do now is go ahead and take a look at the Q&A and maybe come back on. Let's see here. Let me stop sharing my screen for the moment. And let's start my video. Okay, so then we have some questions here that, let me see if I can get through these questions. Okay. Mulch recommendation, balance water conservation needs with fire resistance. Yeah, so for Firewise landscapes, you're gonna want to use non-combustible materials, particularly around the home. So recommendations would be decorative rock or gravel. You can use a really fine compost as well, as long as it doesn't have a lot of like woody debris in it. Some of the composts can be, thicker material with some woody debris that would still be flammable. But if it's really refined compost, like there are some available at some of the landscape supply companies, and that could potentially be used as well. Let's see, is there someone local to inspect my property for Firewise planting? Are rhodies fire prone? Now, rhododendrons, if they're kept, well maintained, are considered to be fire resistant plants. And I am not 100% sure. We'll have to get back to you. There was a unit that was going out and doing Firewise inspections on properties. I think it was through the Department of Forestry. There was a fund that came through that was doing that. I don't know, to be honest, if they're currently still doing that or not, but the local Oregon Department of Forestry would be a good place to contact and find out if they still have somebody doing those site evaluations. Also, Project Wildfire here in in Central Oregon would be another resource that may be able to help you or let you know if they're doing any of that inspection. Importance of cheatgrass mitigation. Yeah, cheatgrass mitigation is a big one. That's actually, depending on where you live, it's a real problem. So yes, you want to definitely be maintaining and managing your cheatgrass, especially within that first 100 feet around the home if you have a lot that big. There's some good publications available online on cheatgrass mitigation that I actually would refer you to. If you want to stay on after, I can do that. It's, I believe it's through the University of Nebraska, has a really nice one, maybe Nevada, have some good publications. So if you reach out to me through my email and ask me that question, I'll be able to redirect you to that cheatgrass publication that talks about the best ways to manage for it. It's kind of a combination of techniques. Yeah, so how do you balance fire prevention with water conservation, especially with the use of turf grass? So that's where it comes back to prioritization. And, we're in a situation where we need to be thinking about both. We really need to be good stewards. So we need to be conserving our water use, especially in drought conditions. But if Firewise is your predominant, goal, then you're going to have to be deciding what to do there, because turf grass, I wouldn't be recommending large swaths of turf grass around a home, but in certain areas, it can be a really effective use of plant material for creating a defensible space. And so there are more drought tolerant types of turf grass that can be used here. Turf type tall fescue is going to be the most drought tolerant and will create a full stand of grass still. Other options could be to use ground covers that'll fill in like turf grass that are somewhat steppable. And there's a few options like that with your low growing times, like woolly thyme and those sorts of things. Sometimes people will put in the yarrow and just keep it mowed. So there's some options that are going to be a little more drought tolerant than a turf grass stand. And so it really just depends on what your goals are, because some people may not be wanting to use turf grass because of its water use, but if you're using the real drought tolerant type and using it just where you would think it'd be most effective in creating a defensible space, then it's a possibility that maybe you could use that. But that's where you have to make a decision about what's best. Okay, I can show you, let me pull up. Go here. The next question is the Waterwise guide. I'm going to pull that up for you and share my screen again, just so you can take a look at that page. Let me go back in here and share my screen once I get that pulled up.
Amy Jo, this is Vicki.
Yes.
Is that the OSU Landscape Plants Database?
No, I think what they're referring to is the Waterwise guide.
Okay, because I could put that link in the Q&A.
Yeah, that would be great if you want to do that. Because that was one that I mentioned. It's a more recent guide.
I think Natalie's putting that link in right now.
Okay. And yeah, so, and then let me see if I can just share that real quick. So here is that guide. I'm not sure you're able to see it. Or are you seeing something different?
No, we're seeing the Waterwise gardening, the front page. Yes.
Yeah, so if you scroll, so again, the focus of this guide is Waterwise, not Firewise, but sorry, I'm probably making it seasick here, but I just want to show you. So there are plants, the designation here that you can see is, so if you look in the middle here underneath where it says hardiness stone for this European beech, for example, you can see the fire resistant icon here that tells you that has that characteristic. And so that's a nice choice for you to use in addition to the fire resistant plant guide that we mentioned, because this is actually more current, and it includes Firewise plants as well. I'm hoping that's what you were asking, it looks like. Are penstemon deer resistant? Penstemon are considered to be deer resistant, although I know you will definitely have people that will, gardeners that will tell you, no, the deer ate my penstemon. So again, to me, it's one of those plants that's in research it's listed as being deer resistant, but I feel like the deer will browse on it occasionally, depending on what their winter feeding has been like. So it's kind of hit or miss there, depending on what else you have around you in your landscape. Okay, we have a large amount of Oregon grape near our house. Is this fire resistant plant? It is considered to be a fire resistant plant, but again, you want to keep it cleaned and well maintained. But Oregon grape is considered to be fire resistant. Okay. Let's see here.
Okay, so Amy Jo, on the first question from Ellie, it was the second part. Are there particular local nurseries that tend to offer good Firewise guidance? That was one we weren't clear if you had a suggestion.
Yeah, I can't think of any one garden that I know like specializes it, but I know that some of these nurseries that are local here have they have had the fire resistant plant guide at times. I don't know if they're still, if they still have them or they're giving them away, what they're doing with them as a resource. And then also the Waterwise guide that will list some fire resistant plant material. But I can't think of any one nursery that it's necessarily like an emphasis for them, but I think some of them are well versed in Firewise landscaping. So I would just check with some of the local nurseries in town here. And just the good news is that you could take this guide and take it with you. And actually, let's see if I can show you this. So this Waterwise gardening guide too, it actually has like a mobile application to it. So right here where it says go straight to the plant list, try this app. If you bring this up on your smartphone and you go into a nursery, it actually has this way of pulling up these plants, and you can actually filter the plants for ones that are going to say fire resistant. See how this is listed here on the right, like under the barberry, for example, fire resistant, and you can actually filter that plant for fire resistance, and it will bring up a bunch of these different plants, and you would have it right on your phone. You could use it in a nursery. That was kind of the intention of creating this mobile app, for people to be able to select plants accordingly. Okay, did I miss any other questions?
We're looking at it right now, and
That's what I'm looking for. Database. Okay. That's what
I think that was it.
Okay, and then yeah, so be looking forward to the new revised fire resistant plant guide, because we are planning on getting that out hopefully in the next couple of months. So that'll be available electronically, and I'm hoping to get some funding to get it printed on hard copy as well for folks that prefer hard copy. And then feel free to contact me if you've got questions about Firewise landscaping. Like I said, and then let me see if I can bring up Project Wildfire. Let's just see if.
And Amy Jo, I did put your email in the Q&A so that people could get in touch with you.
So yeah, this may be another good website that, this is specific to our region. And so you may want to community wildfire protection plans and resources. So this might be a good option for those of you that are asking, like, can somebody come out and do a site evaluation? I would contact them, because this is a local resource to us, where we've got some local individuals that work for Project Wildfire, and it's all about protecting communities here.
And I believe I put that contact, the homepage for Project Wildfire, that's also in the Q&A.
Okay. And then last but not least, I'd appreciate you guys. We have an evaluation. I have an evaluation for you to fill out about the class today. And I know that you'll get sent that link, and we're going to put that link out following right when you go to exit out. It'll pop up for you if you wouldn't mind filling it out. That's helpful for me to know what other kinds of information you're looking for in something like this. So, and just thanks for supporting our spring gardening seminar in the Central Oregon Master Gardener program.
And if you could stop sharing your screen for just a quick minute,
Yes.
we have one last slide to put up for people. So thank you, Amy Jo. Awesome information, very, very relevant. And to all of our attendees, thank you for hanging in with us. And this is just a reminder that we will send a recording of the webinar and the links to you via email, and they will be available for a short period of time after the session. And as Amy Jo just indicated, please fill out the evaluation because the feedback's really important to her and to us. And finally, our silent auction is still going on through the end of the day today. So if you have money in your wallet, you'd love to donate to the cause, please visit that auction site. And thank you so much. We've got one more session today on greenhouses, and that will close out our spring seminar series.
And just give me 1 minute here and I'll be able to put that hard copy of that of the document, the PowerPoint presentation in the chat, and you should be able to download that. But I think there's a way also that they can email that to the participant
If
list.
you,
Is that correct?
well, if you provide a link that they can get to it electronically, yes, we will be able to put it in the email. We have to explore how to actually do an attachment to that email. And right now the attendees can't chat. I would have to set that so everyone could see it.
Okay.
So
Loading up right now. I'm loading up the fire resistant plant presentation in the chat, and I think it should be there. Is it there as a PDF?
I just saw that.
So I think if you leave it on for just a few minutes to give people
I
a
am.
chance to download it, then that should work for them. Thanks for the reminder.
So everyone should be able to see that in the chat because I set that for everybody. And we'll download it. And Natalie and I have already been chatting, and to our attendees who might still be online, we will figure out a way to get this to you if you haven't been able to download it. So I see some people aren't able to see the link. But they're responding in the chat. So again, we'll get it to our participants, not to worry. We'll figure that out. And thank you, because a lot of people did ask for that, Amy Jo.
It's actually the file itself, not a link.
A link.
Amy Jo, to make it happen, you'd have to select chat to everyone. Right now you're chatting just to us, the host.
Oh.
That's why people are not seeing it.
Oh, okay. Okay, let's see if I can try that again.
You're muted, Amy Jo.
But everyone, we will get you that PDF. Do not worry.
Okay, it's loading now. So if you want on the line, I'll send it to you. But it is loading for everyone. Thanks. Didn't realize I did it just to the there. Now maybe you can see it. I'm not sure.
And yes, it does say that. It says to everyone. So for those of you hanging on, and there are quite a few of you, hang in for a few seconds and you should be able to get to this. Okay, so given the time, okay, someone just said done, thank you in the chat. So given the time that we have, and just a reminder, we've got one more session this afternoon if you're interested in that, or if you're already signed up, that's great. And I think that, Amy Jo, unless you've got something else, I am going to go ahead and close this. And again, for those of you who did not get the PDF down link or for the actual document, we will get that to you after the session is over, sometime, not today, but sometime during the following week. So we're good? I think we're good. Okay, so everyone have a wonderful rest of your April Saturday afternoon, and we're signing off. Thank you.